Picture the moment. A crude wooden club crashes into a golden visor. A screaming man is torn from his warhorse by a mob of peasants, dragged through the mud and beaten until the movement stops. They hack at the royal crest, then raise the blood-soaked helmet into the air, roaring in triumph. They are certain they've just killed Charles I, King of Hungary. But 50 yards away, half submerged in filth, the real king watches. He's dressed like a common soldier. His hands are shaking. The man dying in his armor is Desh, a loyal knight who volunteered to wear the king's regalia as a decoy. Every blow meant for the monarch lands on him instead. This brutal deception marks the climax of the Battle of Posada in 1330, a disaster so complete it nearly erased a superpower from the map. Before we step deeper into this forgotten nightmare of survival and collapse, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider liking the video and subscribing. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It's wild to think we're piecing together these ancient stories from across the world, bound by the same curiosity. For 4 days in the mountains, panic ruled everything. To understand how one of Europe's strongest kingdoms unraveled into a starving, terrified mob, we have to strip away legend and look at the men behind the swords. Charles Robert of the House of Anjou didn't inherit power. He seized it. His early reign was defined by violence against Hungary's oligarchs, the so-called Little Kings, who ruled their territories like private kingdoms. Charles crushed them one by one. He confiscated castles, seized gold mines, centralized the currency, and bent the nobility to his will. By 1330, Hungary was a superpower. Its gold fueled Europe's economy. Its army was among the most feared on the continent. Charles commanded elite heavy cavalry, knights mounted on massive destriers bred to smash infantry lines through sheer force. Their armor turned arrows into rain. To Charles, the map of Europe looked pliable. He believed absolutely in the divine authority of his crown. Then there was Basarab I. Basarab, founder of Wallachia, didn't challenge Charles with armies or grand declarations. He challenged him with patience and geography. While Charles built a war machine, Basarab quietly constructed a trap. Wallachia was young, fragile, and surrounded by threats. To the east loomed the Golden Horde, remnants of the Mongol terror. To the west stood Hungary, wealthy, Catholic, and hungry for expansion. Basarab unified local voivodeships not with spectacle, but necessity. His light infantry could never survive a cavalry charge on open ground, so he made sure one never happened. The conflict began with a demand. Charles declared Wallachia a vassal state. He wanted tribute. He wanted obedience. He wanted borders secured on his terms. Basarab responded with diplomacy. He sent envoys bearing gold. He offered hostages. He tried to purchase his country's independence. Charles rejected everything. To him, negotiation was weakness. Basarab wasn't a ruler. He was a shepherd pretending to be one. So Charles gathered an army of roughly 30,000 men and marched south. His goal was simple: cross the Carpathians, burn the capital at Curtea de Argeș, and install a puppet governor. Contemporary illustrations show the army advancing in perfect formation, banners high, armor gleaming. They expected a decisive battle on open ground. What they found instead was nothing. As the Hungarians pushed deeper into Wallachia, villages stood abandoned. Wells were poisoned or dry. Granaries were empty. The enemy refused to appear. Hunger arrived before the first arrow. Horses weakened. Knights baked inside their armor as they trudged through hostile terrain, chasing a foe they couldn't see. By the time Charles realized the mistake, it was too late. With supplies nearly gone and his army starving, he ordered a retreat toward Transylvania. But the only route home ran through a narrow mountain defile, sheer cliffs on either side, barely wide enough for a column to pass. Basarab had been waiting for this. From the ridges above, Wallachian scouts watched the Hungarians withdraw. They let the vanguard pass. They let the king enter the corridor. And when the bulk of the army compressed into the narrowest stretch, where horses couldn't turn and lances were useless, Basarab gave the signal. The trap didn't snap shut. It detonated. To grasp how catastrophic this moment was, you have to understand the imbalance. This wasn't a clash between equals. It was an empire at its peak colliding with a state that barely existed on parchment. Charles I stood as a titan of his age. By the 1320s, Hungary controlled a staggering share of Europe's gold supply. That wealth funded standing armies, mercenaries, and the finest armor money could buy. Charles believed it was his destiny to bring order to the wild frontiers beyond his borders. Basarab, by contrast, remains a shadowy figure in the historical record. Even his name suggests Cuman or Turkic roots, tying him to steppe peoples long dismissed as barbarians by Europe's courts. He ruled not through spectacle, but survival. He balanced tribute to the Golden Horde, while quietly consolidating power between the Danube and the mountains. To Charles, none of that mattered. Wallachia was terra transalpina, land beyond the mountains, not a neighbor, a possession. The tension snapped when Basarab seized the fortress of Severin, a strategic gateway controlling trade and military access. He stopped paying tribute. In Charles's court, this wasn't politics. It was rebellion. Advisors whispered that the Wallachians were primitive, poorly armed, easy prey. The campaign, they said, would be a simple police action. Basarab knew better. He knew heavy cavalry needed open plains. He knew forests and passes turned knights into prisoners of their own armor. And while Charles prepared for a triumphal march, Basarab prepared the mountains themselves for war. The opening move seemed to confirm Hungary's confidence. The fortress at Severin fell almost without resistance. Basarab withdrew, surrendering it outright. To Charles, this looked like victory. In captured territory, he established a temporary court. Then another envoy arrived from Basarab, this time with an offer so extreme it bordered on desperation. Basarab promised to renounce all claims to Severin. He offered full-back tribute. He pledged one of his sons as a hostage, and he offered 7,000 marks of silver, nearly 2 tons, enough to fund an army for months. Many Hungarian nobles urged acceptance. Charles refused. According to the Chronicon Pictum, the king sneered, declaring, "Basarab is the shepherd of my sheep, and I will drag him by his beard from his lair." With that insult, diplomacy died. Charles ordered the march to continue, away from supply lines, deeper into the forests, chasing a man who had already finished building the trap. Charles led his army straight into a green nightmare. As the Hungarian columns pushed deeper into the southern Carpathians, roads dissolved into muddy scars. The dense forest canopy swallowed the light, turning noon into twilight. But the terrain wasn't the true enemy. The silence was. Basarab had stripped the land clean. Villages were nothing but smoldering frames. Granaries stood empty. Wells were fouled with rot and carcasses. The shepherd had moved his flock and burned the pasture behind him. This was scorched earth, executed with precision. Days dragged into weeks. The massive baggage train, meant to haul plunder back to Hungary, became a liability. Food vanished. 30,000 men began to starve. The Chronicon Pictum describes armored knights digging in the soil for roots. Discipline collapsed as hunger erased hierarchy. Soldiers slaughtered their prized destriers just to survive, killing the very weapons they depended on for battle. Leather saddles were boiled and chewed. Dysentery followed famine, ripping through an army already weak and desperate. And still, the Wallachians remained unseen. Occasional arrows hissed out of the trees, killing scouts or stragglers. Each time the heavy cavalry wheeled to respond, the attackers melted back into the forest. The army wasn't fighting soldiers. It was fighting the land itself. Paranoia spread. Every shadow felt hostile. By the time they reached the outskirts of Curtea de Argeș, the capital was either abandoned or impossible to take with a starving force. Charles faced an unthinkable truth. His army wasn't losing a war. It was dissolving. With winter approaching, the king ordered a retreat, but he didn't go back the way he came. Whether he sought a faster route or underestimated the danger, Charles turned toward Transylvania through a different mountain pass. In his mind, the worst was over. The campaign was a humiliation, not a catastrophe. Basarab thought otherwise. Wallachian forces raced ahead, climbing the ridges, felling trees, stacking stones. This wasn't a retreat they were preparing for. It was an execution. The exact location of Posada remains debated even today. The word itself simply means pass or defile. Historians argue over valleys and ridgelines, but the geography is clear. Basarab chose a place where mountains closed in like jaws. As the Hungarian column entered the defile, space disappeared. The path narrowed until only a few horses could ride abreast. On one side, a sheer drop into a ravine. On the other, steep forested cliffs rising into mist. The army stretched into a long, fragile line. The vanguard couldn't see the rear. Orders dissolved before they traveled 10 yards. The heavy cavalry, the pride of Hungary, was now a curse. In open fields, a knight was a living battering ram. Here, he was trapped in traffic, locked into his saddle, unable to turn or charge. High above, hidden by fog and fir trees, thousands of Wallachians waited. They had spent days loosening boulders. They stacked logs. They built a barricade across the path. As the Hungarian vanguard rounded a bend, they stopped cold. Earth and timber blocked the way forward. Shouts echoed down the column. Conflicting orders rippled through the line. Horses panicked. Men pressed together, armor scraping against armor. The gorge fell silent. Then something moved above them. A single sound, maybe a horn, maybe the crack of stone, echoed through the pass, and gravity answered. The sky came down. Boulders tumbled from the cliffs, gathering speed as they smashed into the trapped column. Horses were crushed instantly. Knights were flattened in their saddles. Armor that deflected arrows folded under the weight of stone. The Chronicon Pictum shows peasants calmly rolling rocks while nobles died below, encased in metal coffins. Panic spread faster than the falling stones. Horses reared and screamed, trampling riders. The narrow road turned into a grinder of flesh and iron. Those not crushed were pinned beneath their comrades. Then the arrows began to fall. From above, Wallachian archers rained death into the packed mass. They didn't need precision. Every arrow found a body, a neck, a horse's flank. Commanders screamed orders that no one could hear. Attempts to climb the slopes ended in failure. Heavy armor dragged men back into the crush or sent them tumbling to their deaths. The cliffs were unclimbable. The enemy was untouchable. The killing continued into the night. The Wallachians knew the terrain. They harassed the trapped army without pause. Fires couldn't be lit. Sleep was impossible. Men stood in blood-soaked mud, waiting for the next impact, listening to the groans of the dying. By the second day, the gorge was carpeted with corpses. Exhausted survivors were dehydrated, delirious, and broken. The social order of chivalry meant nothing here. A peasant with a rock had absolute power over a duke with a sword. Basarab wasn't fighting a battle. He was supervising an extermination. There was no need for close combat. The high ground did the work. The mountains had captured the army. Physics would finish it. For the Hungarians, there was no enemy to strike, only vertical stone and falling death. Somewhere in the chaos sat Charles I, watching his vision of empire collapse into screaming ruin. And the nightmare was far from over. By the third day, the concept of an army no longer existed. The defile had become a tomb. Survivors clawed over bodies just to breathe. The stench of rot and blood filled the narrow corridor. Charles understood the truth with horrifying clarity. He was going to die here. The arrows crept closer. Shouts echoed from the cliffs as Wallachians prepared to descend. In this moment of absolute terror, the king made a final, desperate calculation. He summoned Desiderius Hedervari, Desh, one of his most loyal commanders. Charles removed his royal surcoat, emblazoned with the ostrich of Anjou. He took off his gilded helmet. He ordered Desh to wear them. The plan was simple and merciless. The Wallachians were hunting the crown. Give them what they wanted. Desh accepted without protest. Clad in royal colors, he rode into the heart of the kill zone, shouting commands, drawing every eye and arrow. The ruse worked. Wallachian fighters surged down from the cliffs, abandoning their positions to reach the golden figure below. They dragged Desh from his horse. There was no trial, no mercy. He was beaten, hacked apart, and dismembered by a mob convinced they were killing a tyrant. A club shattered the visor. Blood soaked the armor. Cheers echoed through the pass. While his friend died in his place, Charles fled. Disguised in filthy leather, blending in with terrified foot soldiers, the King of Hungary slipped toward the edge of the gorge with a handful of guards. The most powerful monarch in Central Europe escaped like a criminal in the night. Behind him, the massacre reached its peak. Believing the king dead, Hungarian resistance collapsed. Wallachians moved through the wreckage, slashing hamstrings, pulling knights from saddles, finishing them in the mud. The casualty list was catastrophic. The High Chancellor fell. The Voivode of Transylvania died. Bishops and high clergy, men who had come to bless the campaign, were slaughtered alongside common soldiers. The Chronicon Pictum called it a red harvest. By the fourth day, silence returned. The screams faded. The gorge echoed only with rushing water, now dark with blood. Basarab had not merely defeated the Hungarian army, he had erased it. And Charles I, though alive, left everything else behind in the mud of Posada. Charles's return to Visegrad was not a triumph. It was a funeral procession without the bodies. Of the 30,000 men who had marched south with banners flying and armor gleaming, only a shattered remnant staggered home. They carried no plunder, no hostages, no victory. They carried a story, one whispered with fear, of an army annihilated in a mountain pass by men armed with rocks. The king himself was unrecognizable. He had survived only by hiding his identity and sacrificing a friend. The psychological wound cut deeper than the physical escape. Charles had spent his reign crafting the image of an absolute monarch, chosen by God, destined to tame the East. At Posada, that image cracked. The hammer of the world had struck the Carpathians and shattered. For Hungary, the defeat was catastrophic but not fatal. The kingdom was rich. Its institutions endured. Charles would rebuild his forces and continue to rule for another decade, overseeing prosperity and reform. But one thing never happened again. He never returned to Wallachia. The dream of absorbing the lands beyond the mountains died in that gorge. The border was drawn in blood, and it held. For Basarab I, Posada changed everything. He didn't pursue the fleeing Hungarians. He didn't invade Transylvania. He understood exactly what he had achieved and what he hadn't. His goal was never conquest. It was survival. By annihilating the royal host, Basarab secured de facto independence. He was no longer a vassal to be summoned, no longer a shepherd to be mocked. He was a sovereign. The victory legitimized his rule not just among his people, but across Europe. Before Posada, Wallachia was a loose collection of chiefdoms living in the shadow of greater powers. After Posada, it was a state. This moment marks the true birth of Wallachia as a country. Basarab would be remembered as Basarab Intimayatorul, Basarab the founder. His dynasty, the House of Basarab, would rule for centuries. From his bloodline would come rulers who understood the same brutal lesson of survival, including a certain Vlad the Impaler. Ironically, politics would eventually normalize. Years later, Basarab and Charles would sign treaties again, forced into pragmatism by the rising threat of the Ottoman Empire. But the relationship had changed forever. They spoke as equals, or at least as distinct powers. The feudal chain was broken. So why did Posada happen? How did a force of peasants dismantle one of the finest war machines of the 14th century? The answer isn't romance, it's math. Posada was not an accident. It was part of a broader shift in medieval warfare, often called the infantry revolution. Just 15 years earlier, at Morgarten, Swiss peasants ambushed Austrian knights in a narrow pass using logs and terrain. Later, at Agincourt, English longbowmen would destroy French nobility using mud and distance. The pattern is consistent. Technology doesn't guarantee victory. Context does. Charles relied on heavy cavalry shock tactics. A charging knight is kinetic energy made flesh, a weapon of momentum, terror, and mass. But momentum requires space. By luring the Hungarians into a defile, Basarab shut the engine off. A stationary knight isn't elite. He's slow, blind, and trapped inside his own armor. Then there's the economics of the kill. War is an investment. Charles poured the GDP of a kingdom into his army. Plate armor cost fortunes. War horses required years of breeding. Knights trained their entire lives. Basarab's costs were almost nothing. His weapons were gravity, stone, and timber, resources that were free. His soldiers were peasants whose training was surviving in the mountains. In economic terms, Basarab achieved an infinite return on investment. He traded rocks for silver. But the true architect of Hungary's defeat wasn't geography, it was psychology. Charles fell victim to command arrogance. He violated the oldest rule of warfare: know the terrain. Worse, he despised it. He was so consumed by political narrative that he was king and Basarab was a rebel, that he forgot armies are biological systems. They need food, water, rest, and space. Even when supplies ran out, he pushed forward, trapped by the sunk cost fallacy. Turning back felt like admitting defeat. When he finally did retreat, he chose the path that saved face, not lives. He assumed the Wallachians would fear a wounded lion. He forgot that wounded lions bleed. Posada stands as a permanent case study in military incompetence. Superior power means nothing if you can't deploy it. In the rock, paper, scissors of war, a rock dropped from high enough will always beat the sharpest blade. Today, the exact site of the battle remains hidden beneath forests. Nature has reclaimed the bones, the rusted iron, the spilled silver. But the legacy of those 4 days in 1330 is carved into Europe's map. Basarab didn't just win a battle, he bought time. Wallachia would survive for centuries in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods on earth, wedged between Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and later the Russian Tsars. It survived because it remembered Posada's lesson: never fight the enemy's war. Fight your own. The House of Basarab became the spine of Romanian history. Its rulers, Mircea the Elder, Vlad the Impaler, were all students of the founder. They understood that when you are small, survival isn't about honor or chivalry. It's about making conquest too expensive. For Charles I, Posada was the scar beneath a golden reign. He died remembered as a great king who ushered Hungary into prosperity, but the chronicles suggest he never escaped the memory of fleeing in dirty clothes while his friends died for him. It is a warning written in blood. When leaders believe their own propaganda, when they dismiss rivals as shepherds or barbarians, they are already inside the trap. The Battle of Posada isn't just a clash of swords. It's a story of endurance, of desperation, of people armed with nothing but terrain and resolve standing against an empire and saying, "No further." History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the survivors. If you made it through this mountain pass with me, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Posada, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And let me ask you this: was Charles I defeated by arrogance, or was he simply caught on the wrong side of history's shift in warfare? Let me know in the comments. Check out the next video on your screen for another moment when the underdog changed the world. I'll see you there.